Now, there are four great truths that we're going to take a look at. First, an understanding of how God will purify his church at end time. Secondly, an understanding of God's view of church organization. Thirdly, an understanding of the difference between apostasy in the church and the church being in apostasy. And fourthly, an understanding of God's plan for finishing his work. So let's dive right into our topic, God's method of purifying his church. If you look throughout history, God has always called out faithful believers. God called out Abraham from the nations around him so that Abraham's family would not be infected with the heresy of idolatry. God called out the Jewish nation to be his own special people, according to Deuteronomy, from Egyptian bondage. After God called them out, he worked within the Jewish community, giving them the Ten Commandments to lead them, again, from false gods and idolatry, and lead them back to Sabbath observance. And he gave them specific laws that would govern and guide the Jewish community. God called them out. As the Jewish nation drifted from God's original purpose, God called out the New Testament Christian church. In fact, the word church is ekklesia in the Greek language, ek meaning out, and ekklesia meaning called. So God called out the New Testament Christian church. As the church grew large, it entered into apostasy. God has always had faithful men and women in every phase of church history down through the centuries. But as the Christian church grew large, church and state united, you know the story well. Shortly after the days of Constantine, by the time you come to 538 AD, we have the medieval church, the Roman Catholic Church, a church that during the Middle Ages persecuted the people of God, a church that was in apostasy. So what did God do? He called out of the medieval church the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant reformers were the called out ones. You have the Waldenses, you have Huss and Jerome. Obedience to God was their motto. Faithfulness to Scripture. Martin Luther with salvation is by grace through faith. And you have the Baptists and the Anabaptist movements, baptism by immersion, and the Methodists that talk about holiness, and the Millerite movement that talks about the advent of Christ, and Sabbath keepers. God called out of the larger body of Protestantism, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to restore the truths of Scripture that had been lost sight of down through the ages in the medieval church, the union of church and state, but some of which were recovered by the reformers. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a called out body.
So the fundamental thesis of the discussion around Adventism being the remnant is predicated upon error and historical revisionism, which is exactly what the Great Controversy worldview does. It distorts and rewrites to try and support a pretextual narrative. None of the Protestant reformers, none of them had this view of history that Mark is trying to associate them with. None of them believed that the church went into apostasy during the Middle Ages and that God raised them up to essentially restore the church, which is important in this discussion because the trifecta of claims is built upon this fundamental error. As church historian Philip Schaff notes in his book Principles of Protestantism, quote, "To be true to its own idea, a reformation must hold its course midway, or through the deep rather between two extremes. In opposition on the one side to revolution, or a radical and violent overthrow of an existing system, it must attach itself organically to what is already at hand and grow forth thus from the trunk of history in regular living union with its previous development. In opposition to simple restoration, on the other side, or a mere repetition of the old, it must produce from the womb of this the birth of something new." And then he continues a couple pages later where he writes, "In the first place, we contemplate the Reformation in its strictly historical condition. its Catholic union with the past. This is a vastly important point, which thousands in our day appear to overlook entirely. They see in the 31st of October, 1517, when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses, it is true the birthday of the evangelical church, and find her certificate of baptism in the 95 Theses of Luther, but at the same time cast a deep stain upon the legitimacy of this birth itself by separating it from all right relation to the time that went before. In this way, all interest is renounced in the spiritual wealth of the Middle Ages, which, however, belongs to us of right as fully, at least, it does to the Church of Rome. And what is worse still, the lie is given practically to the Lord's promise itself, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world." So the Protestant reformers saw themselves as entirely attached to the medieval church. Whether you agree with them or disagree with them is neither here nor there. The point being, they did not believe that the church was completely apostate and that starting with Martin Luther, it needed to be restored. The church can be thought of as a tree. Jesus planted this tree, and over time, some of the branches became diseased. The diseased branches picturing doctrinal accretions that aren't ultimately rooted in Scripture. These branches then needed to be pruned back. But this is vastly different than thinking that the core, trunk, or root of the tree was diseased, such that a new one needed to be planted or raised up. And as Schaff importantly points out, the Protestant reformers saw themselves as invested, interested, and rightful recipients of the spiritual wealth of the Middle Ages, not that the Church of the Middle Ages was apostate. What Schaff put forth is not compatible with Adventism's fundamental framework, and it's one of the key pieces of evidence that the SDA movement is not Protestant. They have simply tried to cherry pick certain things from those individuals by claiming they all had something to contribute to the whole, but the systems that they themselves affirmed were still apostate. Adventism is supposed to be the entire collection of all of the correct restored truths from each varying group, all housed in one place as the 100% doctrinally pure remnant, completely distinct and separate from Babylon. As SDA historian George Knight documents in his book Search for Identity, quote, North American Protestantism of the 19th century was a child of the 16th century Reformation. Many Adventists are aware of that fact, but have mistakenly concluded that their church is an heir of those branches of the Reformation initiated by Martin Luther, John Calvin, or Ulrich Zwingli. While it is true that Adventist concept of salvation by grace through faith comes through the mainline reformers, the theological orientation of Adventism really finds itself more at home with what church historians call the Radical Reformation, or the Anabaptists. This is a more accurate summation of Adventism's connection to Protestantism, which is why what Mark Finley presented is not accurate, and it puts a crack in the foundational claims that he is parroting from the Great Controversy. The SDA movement is more akin to the Anabaptist radical reformers, what Philip Schaff referred to as radicalists, not Protestant. The Protestant reformers would have denounced William Miller and Ellen G. White as what they were, false prophets and schismatics. Yet what Mark is saying here about history is necessary for their entire concept of the remnant in Babylon to be true, and it's built upon historical revisionism and error. Remember this as he begins to try and present a biblical case for this.